first Auxin of the year, we have a long series of presentations that are going to come up throughout the year. So you'll be getting the invites as they come. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Charmaine, who's going to introduce our speaker for today. Over to you, Charmaine.
Thank you, Sim. Good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome at this Auxin session. So I'm Charmaine van der Merwe from the Centre for Teaching and Learning and the advisor in the Agri-Sciences faculty. So it is my pleasure to welcome our presenter for today, Dr. Rhoda Malgas. When I asked Rhoda to send me a bio about herself, she didn't write anything about herself, but all about her passion for her module and for her students, which is very fitting for the talk that Rhoda is going to have with us. So maybe I can just mention that Rhoda is a lecturer in Conservation Ecology, which is part of the Agri-Sciences faculty. And just a little bit about what Rhoda wrote. She is very interested in how can I get my students to learn attributes and skills that are fundamental to conservation sciences for an uncertain future and that are hard to teach explicitly. This is what drives my creativity in the BSc Conservation Ecology teaching program. She teaches on sustainable agriculture, sustainable wild fynbos harvesting, and ecosystems, goods and services in agri-landscapes. And she especially enjoys her third-year module, which is conservation in social ecological systems. So welcome, Rhoda. We look forward to your presentation and what you are going to share with us. This is a wonderful campaign. So I've already had discussions with Rhoda about this in the last couple of years. I'm looking forward to it. So please, colleagues, if you have any questions or comments for Rhoda, you are welcome to type that in the chat. And then after about 40 minutes, we will give you a chance to engage with Rhoda. So Rhoda, you can go ahead. You're just on mute at the moment, Rhoda.
Thanks. I was just fiddling between screens, and thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Charmaine, and thank you, everybody. Right, so I am indeed a lecturer in conservation ecology and entomology, and I have been since 2009. The course that I'm going to talk to you about today, I inherited from my predecessor, and so I kind of got a package deal, and the course starts in the second semester, so I had a few months to prepare, yeah, that's what I'll talk to you about today. So I walk into this pre-designed course. It is a third-year course. At that stage, we had up to 56 students 1 year, but these days the student numbers are down to about 21 or so. There were three tensions for me at the start of this, when I came up with this campaign idea. The first is that I found that my students were struggling to write, besides technical problems, grammar and spelling. There was also this thing about writing things like, let's say, people in informal settlements cause litter problems, or rich people are not considering the environmental impact of their lifestyles, and so on. And I used to challenge my students and say, well, what rich people are you talking about? And do you have any data to substantiate your claims? Now, they were making normative statements based on societal narratives. And the idea was to challenge them a little bit on exactly what they mean, because there are many rich people who are passionate about conservation and, in fact, fund entire organizations that do conservation work. There are lots of poor people who live in informal settlements who are not littering, and so on. So the idea was to try to challenge these normative statements that they were making. On the other hand, I also understood that my class is demographically not very diverse. We have probably, I would say, between 90 and 95% white students. Other diversity measures like gender, so that we've got, if it's just limited to male and female, about 50% if English Afrikaans speaking. But when it comes to ethnic diversity, we don't have many lots of diversity in our class, and also most of our students are local, so they're South African. These days, in this semester, actually, we have a few more international students. So that was another limitation. How do we get to hear perspectives about the environment from people who are not represented in the classroom? And then the last tension I was struggling with was how to raise concerns that are socially embedded in a conservation science degree. I've had it in the past where students said, oh, but I didn't sign up for this, let's say, sociology class or an anthropology class. I came here to study science. So those were some of the challenges that I faced in the earlier years when I entered the course. So this is a paper that was published in 2021, and it shows how people who are influential in conservation are clustered. So it's just, the paper is basically trying to say that the attitudes and behavior of people is what drives conservation outcomes. And in 2021, which I think mightn't have been the case in earlier papers, you will see there that conservation and environmental managers are also considered actors in the system. It used to be that we used to consider ourselves outside of the system and always be thinking what other people should be doing to conserve the environment. And I think that in those earlier years, that was exactly the kind of preconceived ideas that the students had, was that they were coming at this with the idea that conservation challenges are other people's problems, and for that reason, other people had to do something. So it's very difficult to see yourself in the system. And so these days, we've been challenging that and with some success. So this was my interpretation of the problem when I first came across it. First, I thought students are not exactly socially exposed to socioeconomic groups outside of what they experience in their own household or where they grew up. I tended to be wrong about this. I also thought that students couldn't write, and that wasn't true. They could write. And then lastly, there was this constraint of, but it's a science degree. There are some things that will be difficult to talk about explicitly or to teach explicitly, that will make it challenging in a science degree. I learned later that students are socially exposed to socioeconomic groups different from their own, but that exposure is often skewed. So I had Black and colored students in my class who had a better understanding for the social norms of my white students than white students who had an idea of the lived experience of my Black and colored students. Also, these interactions were oftentimes quite superficial. So, talking about townships, for instance, or township life, but nobody had been to a township before, or talking about life in the suburbs, but the student hadn't been to a high-income suburb before, and so on. So there was the superficial exposure, and I was trying to think, well, how can we deepen that experience? Also, students were quite used to writing scientifically. They also have courses in other science and agri-science courses, so writing for them wasn't so much of an issue as writing, forming their own opinion and critically reviewing literature, and not just saying somebody else's, citing somebody else's work, but forming own opinion and then being able to express that properly. I also think that is partly also a function of where they are in the degree structure. So at second year, writing arguably improves over time. But I wanted to catch any writing issues at the third year level, so that by the time they get to the fourth year, which is our equivalent of the honors year, that they can write much better. And then the last one was this feeling straitjacketed in a science degree. We had this 5% incremental change, and fortunately, in the greater scheme of things, things were also changing. So one of the exercises I like to do with my students is to make a timeline right at the start of the course when we talk about environmental ethics. So we make a timeline. I clear out the class, and we make two groups, and then each group has a piece of masking tape down the middle. And on the one side, we put the year, and on the other side, we put down a relevant event, world event. And what happens in the rest of that practical is that we talk about what the conservation outcomes or the environmental outcomes of that particular world event might have been. Just to mention an example, which isn't here in the slide, is World War II, for instance. What will have happened and how will that have affected conservation science in Europe, but also elsewhere in the world? What happens when there's conflict, for instance, over independence in an African country? and then people might be destroying entire habitats of primates, for instance, and what does that mean for wild species and so on. But anyway, so in 1989 we have the Blunt Report, and why that's important is that it's the place where the sustainable development idea was born. And as you know, in 2023 we have the latest version is now the Kunming goals, but it has until very recently has been the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So all of those internationally celebrated, and what nations work towards. The idea of sustainable development was born in 1989 with the Brundtland Report. In 1993, the Convention to Biological Diversity, South Africa becomes a signatory. Well, already in 1992, but in 1993 we become active members. And until 1993, we had been excluded from this CBD because of apartheid. So we also, then there's space in the class also to talk about environmental events or environmental conventions from which South Africa had been excluded until that time. Most of these students, or all of these students, are born post this period. So it's a good time to kind of talk through the evolution of environmental science in South Africa against this backdrop. Also related to apartheid in some ways is the promulgation of the environment, of the Constitution, and then especially we focus on Section 24 in this course. And we notice in the preamble to this piece of legislation, it says everyone has the right. And that already focuses our attention on people. And it doesn't say every species, it doesn't say every organism, it says everyone. And so we already have an anthropocentric view of the environment that is reflected in our Constitution in Section 24, which governs environmental law. In 1998, the National Environmental Management of Biodiversity Act, number 10, comes into play, and it was revised in 2004 and again in 2014. And another example of how in the Western Cape, or let's say in the Cape region, people were considered important for the environment was with the formation of the Cape Action Plan for People and Environment, and this found resonance with all our policies. Also with the construction of SAMBI and how it operates today. So much of that foundational work was indeed with the recognition that people and the well-being of human beings is central to conservation science. So for me, that gave me some disciplinary permission, I suppose, in some ways, to explore further with my students some of the social aspects of conservation science. The other issue that came up that gave me this idea for the campaign was the fact that we had students feeling rather depressed after being exposed to the environmental crises we face. In 1985, conservation science was dubbed a crisis discipline, and indeed we deal with crises. We are the people who are concerned over the fact that we are pumping too much greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, especially in South Africa now with Eskom burning so much fuel. That's a concern for us. We are the ones who are concerned about the depleting fish resources, seafood resources. We're worried about climate change and so on. So it's a crisis discipline for those reasons. And a lot of the information that we share with our students obviously is about, it's depressing information. So I was feeling very strongly that I certainly do not want my students to leave my class or the course or the program or the university feeling depressed. In fact, I would rather that they feel that they have learned something and that we equip them in ways with skills and knowledge that will help them to be the kinds of ecologists we will need for the future. And so with this in mind, I came up with this Do Something campaign. So I do intermittent fasting as a practice, but I was fasting at the time and I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if the students also got to commit to something for a short period of time and, see if that maybe brings about some kind of change. I wanted something that would be personal to them too. It's easy to say something like, let's say, people shouldn't own 5 cars, but you yourself don't even own one, so you don't know what it entails to own a car. Or people shouldn't have pools, or I know whatever statements people make about each other. I wanted them to be able to choose a topic where the conservation action would be quite personal, and would result in a personal commitment over a short period of time. So it had to have conservation impact. So in other words, if there's nothing that you can do about rhino poaching, but that's what you're passionate about, then there are two solutions. Either you try to do something that changes public behavior or opinion. And so we had a few students in the past come up with creating a blog that raises awareness about rhino poaching. We had another student who used a piece of software to track and create alerts for black market trading of ivory and other things. And she did it just using open source information. So that was another response. And other students decided to leave rhino poaching because it isn't close enough to home for them. So there were some examples of how close the issue had to be and how they dealt with that. We did it in the third term, and it always works best like that. So we do it when the campaign gets introduced the first week in class, and they do it for, it's actually been working better at 2 months and not 3. So we do it for all of August and all of September. I also created a private Facebook page where students are asked to post an update on their campaign every week between Thursday and Friday. And sometimes I write a prompt. In fact, last year was, I actually wrote questions at the end of every Tuesday, and then they would have to respond. And questions are things like, what did today's lecture about Section 24 of the Constitution evoke for you in the context of your Do Something campaign? Or what about something that we covered in class reminds you of something that you've studied in another subject, for instance? So it gets them to think about this subject and the subject matter outside of just the course content. They get 10%, so they get 1 mark for every post. The post has to be written in, I think I said English so that everybody in the class can understand. I don't care about your punctuation and your spelling, and that is the only time in the whole class that ever is a concession. Otherwise, they get penalized quite heavily for poor English use. And they can write as little or as much as they like. I noticed over the years that my male students might write monosyllabic answers to questions 1 through 3, 1 through 5. Sometimes it's usually between 3 and 5 questions. And oftentimes the female students have long essays and soliloquies about the things that they are writing about. But to all intents and purposes, they can see each other's responses, and they seem to really value that, seeing each other's replies. And people can like one another's comments. They can't share because it's a private group, and I keep it private because obviously we're on the internet, and to not expose the students unduly. But it's a private group, so nobody can enter and nobody can share out. I've added over the years where other students from other departments and faculties have asked whether they could please join the Facebook group, because they see our students doing this and they're like, oh, that's a very cool thing. I also want to be part, please. But we don't allow people from the outside the class. So it's contained. And the 1 mark per post, you only get the mark if you have answered all the questions. So if you have 5 questions, but you've only answered 4, you don't get the mark for that week. So then when the marks are tallied up, it counts 10% towards the semester mark. I have found that works well. 10% feels negligible to them some of the time, so there's not too much pressure, but they also know that 1% can be a difference between, let's say, a 69 and 70. So I've not had it that students bail out on these weekly posts usually. And in fact, they might actually fight quite hard that they did answer the post and I didn't give them the mark, even just this 1 mark. So that's worked well. And in exchange for their commitment to doing something every week, they get Friday 8 a.m. lecture off. We still keep it that way. But usually the time is committed to the Do Something campaign. In the campaign, they have to choose something of their choice and then physically do something about it. So let's say they're passionate about litter, and they feel very strongly that that's just poor behavior by citizens in South Africa. Then they may say, well, I'm going to pick up litter along the East River every morning once a week. Or I'm going to Strand Beach to go and do that kind of thing. So whatever they do, they get compensated with this 8 o'clock lecture. And you can imagine that in July and August, when the second semester starts, they're very grateful to not have an 8 a.m. lecture on a Friday morning. I've tried to fit the Do Something campaign with the assessment sequence as well. So this is how it is. We've got a test right at the end of the semester, but the rest of it, we've got flexible assessment. For the rest of it is an individual essay assignment, and there they get to choose what they will do the assignment about. To get them, to challenge them to think critically and to form their own opinions, they are asked to write about something that they are passionate about. Now that means that they have to separate passion and what drives or compels us to make these normative statements about other people, challenge them to think that through, and then find peer-reviewed sources, and only up to 5, that will substantiate their claims. And so there, a set of other skills are being developed. The other thing I'm trying to do with this first assignment is to get them to write properly and write well. If they don't get 75% for this assignment, this first assignment, where they choose the topic, then they have to go to the writing center, and if their name appears on the writing center's list, advise them a remark. And then if the first option, the first attempt counts for 60%, the second for 40%, so that they make a good effort on the first attempt. And they're still striving for 75% because we don't want to celebrate mediocrity. And if they reach whatever, if the second mark, if the remark is higher, then the second mark will be chosen. If it's lower, then the higher of the 2 marks will be chosen as the only mark. So it's worth the time and investment and effort. And I must say, once they've gone through this exercise, their writing does improve. In the second assignment, which is about environmental law, the section of the course, in this case now we try to group the projects together. So maybe 3 people are doing things about litter, and then we'll group those 3 together, and they will then look up all the relevant information and pieces of legislation that have to do with litter in South Africa, and write a review of what is problematic with the literature and with the legislation, and how they would change that. So that's the second assignment. Third assignment is where so that's an EIA one. And then the fourth assignment, they used to have to produce a portfolio of evidence. I don't do that anymore. This is now a science communication exercise. And here they have to pull together a group of people in their own sphere. It can be the knitting team, it can be the rowing team, it can be the rugby club, it can be the gebedsgroep, whoever it is, a group of people in their peer group of whatever, and up to about 15 people, where they have to explain their campaign, and they also have to talk about the legislation behind the campaign. And they then have to conduct a small focus group amongst the people they've gathered together to see what people's opinions are of this particular campaign that they're on. And then at the end of the semester, there's a test. Last year, for the first time, what I did was that I actually got them to not do the portfolio, not do the science communication one, but actually I had them come up with a business idea that would either sway public opinion or change public behavior. And that was really phenomenal to see. They came up with amazing solutions, an app in one case, a business model in another case. And I called 2 friends from the Launch Lab to come and listen to their business ideas. And it was a bit like, I think there's a program on TV called Shark Tank, they tell me. And so you get to pitch your idea, and then it gets evaluated by the experts. So they really like this idea, and it's the kind of idea that if they took it very seriously, of course, could end up at the Launch Lab as something that they could take forward. But I thought that was also a nice little spin on it, because it gets them to think creatively, and it brings us out of this idea of conservation science being the crisis discipline, but without solution. And so, and also for them to apply their knowledge and their creativity to address environmental issues. So yes, this is the Do Something Conservation Ecology 2022 campaign page. It won't show you anything because it's private to only the class, and we don't share outside. But every year I make up a private group like this. We friend each other on Facebook, and this is where the posts and things happen. Then, because we also deal with theory towards the end of the term, we talk about resilience theory and social ecological systems theory. Here's an example of a practical where we get them to take their Do Something campaign. So these 3 people will have had a similar campaign, and we get them to apply Auxin social ecological systems framework, the literature of which they read ahead of time. And they then have to, in the prac, we unpack a campaign and talk about the social, ecological, governance, and environmental implications of people's actions, and then what are the sets of factors that are likely to lead to the best or desirable social ecological outcomes. This is an exercise right at the start of the term where we do that timeline exercise. So we clear out the class. They're all a bit nervous on the first day because it's their first practical, and they're not sure why I've cleared out the whole class. But they soon get into it. And for me, I really like this practice because it gets them to move around. You know, they're moving cards, they're looking up information on their phones. Some of them are texting Oma and Opa to ask them, like, when was the war? And, you know, what year did this happen? What year did that happen? And it also helps them to connect world events with conservation science. I think it can be so, that silo effect of different disciplines being operated in certain contexts. This exercise opens up their thinking and also has them drawing on their history lessons and geography lessons from high school. And thinking about their own lived experience. The Soccer World Cup, for instance, tends to stand out for them as a big event. And we talk about generational information and so on and so forth. So it's a great exercise and they really enjoy it. But then to come back to the greater scheme of things also, there are also other world events where I found that the Do Something campaign created space for us to talk, and that's where this pedagogy of hope comes in. When I started this course in 2009, that's not when I started the campaign. I just became a lecturer in the program at the time. It was at the time when Professor Russell Botma was putting forward his ideas about pedagogy of hope. Now, I came from the NGO sector, so I was familiar with Paulo Freire's work, and now to enter the university at a time when it's being celebrated as a way forward, and also for me as a first-generation student, passionate about the success of first-generation students, coming into a space now where it is recognized that there are social inequalities and where this pedagogy of hope is focused towards not the problem only, like analyzing the problem, but also towards some kind of hopeful outcome. In 2015, Fees Must Fall happened, and it was a good opportunity in the classroom to talk about why is this a big deal. Students were affected in very many different ways, depending on where they were from and what their ideological stances were. But in the Do Something campaign, we could unpack these things and talk about, well, what does it mean for someone who doesn't have this, that, and the other, to consider the environment? Like if this is not something that's on your list of things to think about, is an environmental problem like pollution something that is going to feature on your mind immediately today? And then if it isn't, how do we engage with that, and what can we do in response? The visual redress on campus was also a point of discussion for us in class through the Do Something campaigns. How do we present our science out there as well? Like what visual things do we produce, and what does it say about our science and about us? I thought the gender-based violence protest was also quite interesting in 2019. And fortunately, around that time, there was a guy in our department who was from Mitchell's Plain, like me, and he had done a fourth-year project on the importance of how alien invasive plants and their proliferation is actually a safety and security problem, and not just the Department of Environmental Affairs problem. So he was trying to motivate that actually the Department of Justice should be putting money behind alien invasive clearing, because people's safety is at issue. And also this gender-based violence thing was a good example also to talk about how we think about environment. So let's say the dunes at Khayelitsha and Makassar, the last primary dunes left in the system. The rest have been settled now with informal settlements in Mitchell's Plain and all of these other places. So we talk about how surely we as ecologists are fighting for those dunes to stay in place. But then we talked about, well, what about women who are living in shacks that are unsecure in terms of safety? So you can break into a shack easily. And if your concern is your safety, or the safety of your daughter living there, then maybe that dune that we are fighting so hard to conserve is they're not thinking about it like that. It could be a crime site. It could be quite triggering for someone, because that is the site where something happened to them that is traumatizing for them every day. And so we talk about environment and environmental spaces in ways that we may not have been exposed to socially ourselves, but we can start to put our shoes we can start to put ourselves in the shoes of others who have different lived experiences from ourselves. The COVID pandemic was also a very interesting, zoological thing to talk about, but then all of us having the lived experience of what that means for us. And the energy crisis is these days topical in my class. So I just want to end off by showing you how I've been using the assignments. The allocations are not quite correct here, but basically to say that I've now taken the Do Something campaign and I've draped all the assignments around it, except for the EIA part, which is usually done by someone else. But in the first assignment, they have this individual assignment and they get to choose the topic. In the second assignment, the topics get grouped together, usually about groups of 3, and they get to interrogate the law and legal parts of the Do Something campaign together, and also do it so that they can change legislation. It's not just about knowing it, it's about, now that you know the gaps in it, what can you do to make it better when you get into those positions in government? And to back this one up, we have a practical where we visit the Western Cape Legislature. So they go to see a debate in the House. For them, that's like always a highlight, because they, first of all, a lot of them feel like they really don't want anything to do with politics. And second of all, they get to see how you pitch your scientific argument is so crucial. You need to be able to do it in 2 minutes and in a context where oftentimes people aren't even listening to each other. So that's the practical there. And then the third practical is a group assignment where it's either communication or, in this case, a business pitch last year. And then the last is the Facebook posts that they get marked on. And so this is just the timetable for the whole course. It runs over 14 weeks, but you can see how the Do Something campaign, since it's organized already in the first week and carries out for the grey block and blue block, which takes us to week 5. By the time we get to the theory right at the end, where we're talking about adaptive management and resilience theory and social ecological systems theory, that is, by then they have already all the scaffolded learning about the Do Something campaign and all the parts that go with it, that by the time we apply the theory, we now have different avenues in which we can apply it, think about it, critique it, and respond to it. And that's the end of my story right there.
Oh, thank you so much, Rhoda. I don't know if you can see all the applause coming from the virtual audience. It was really inspiring to listen to your presentation and see how you integrate the theory that you want to get across into practical application with your students. And that's also comments that came from the audience thus far. Hanley has said, love this application of theory to their own projects. Gerda also said, yes, lovely integration and alignment of theory and practical, group and individual, basic writing and the fuller assessment cycle. Jacolette says, this is really fantastic. Lucinda reminding us of the feedback. Even Jennifer Lopez is applauding you there in the chat. Thanks for that, LZ. So open, colleagues, to any questions. If you would like to ask Rhoda a specific question, you can raise your hand. I hope I didn't miss anything in the chat at the moment. So maybe while we wait for anyone to raise a question, it was really interesting to read some of the literature that you have suggested. And specifically, sorry, and maybe it's because it was the most accessible, is the article by Prof. Lagrange, A Pedagogy of Hope, after Paulo Freire, which is very applicable to our context here at Stellenbosch University, and also referring to Prof. Portma's Hope Project, and some, because it's not necessarily something that you think about. What is this pedagogy of hope, and what does it mean, and how does it translate to your classroom? And something interesting that I saw there, and what I was wondering about is the students' critical engagement with each other's stories so that they can grow their identities with each other. And how you had a picture there of 3 students who had similar projects, but might be coming from completely different walks of life. And how do you see growth happening within those students while engaging with each other? Because I guess that's also what you want with this.
Absolutely. And I'm so sorry that I couldn't easily share some of the Facebook posts, because if I just showed you the page, then the students' names and things would come up as well. But I had one student from Anova Park, for instance, working with 2 other students, and this one student was saying that he had never thought that this girl from Anova Park could have a completely different perspective on the same topic, in the same class, in the same degree as he does, and he had just never thought of it before. And so I do think that because the class isn't very demographically diverse in terms of ethnicity and race, and even religion, actually. So when we talk about ethics, I like to talk about, I have one lecture series, one presentation on Judaism and Hinduism and how environment is portrayed in different belief systems across the world. And it's, if there's a student maybe who can offer a Zulu context, for instance, it's always enlightening for everybody else in the class. And now we're dealing with sustainable harvesting of wild species. So, the use of buhu in the household, or for rites of passage in another culture, those are all things that enrich their understanding also of each other. And so we've had comments like, so on the Facebook page, I do ask, something like, what surprised you this week that you've learned in your Do Something campaign? And these are the small little comments that come up. I never thought about it like that before. And for me, those are the most exciting kinds of posts. You get 1 mark for it, but it means a lot.
Yes, great. Agatha says, I love how you integrate ethics into your module. And LZ, love how you help students to open their perspectives to reconnect with fellow human beings. Thank you for bringing hope back to higher education.
Thanks, LZ.
Any of the colleagues who would like to ask Rhoda a question or comment, you are welcome to just switch on your mic as well. So Rhoda, you said these are your 3rd year students.
Yes.
Do you see them again in your 4th year, in their 4th year?
I do, but then the content is quite different. So at the moment, we're dealing with sustainable harvesting of wild terrestrial species. And so that's quite ecological. It's got calculations and life tables and things in it. But next week, we get into policy, cultural norms, and societal things, because when the IPBES, the International Panel on Ecosystem, what is it? What the S stand for? But anyway, there's international panels that get together around climate change or plant use or whatever it is. Then the social aspects actually are quite important. And then how the country that is signatory to that convention, how we filter that information or those targets down into our policies. The students will have to be able to, there'll be lobbyists in future, or they might end up in spaces where policy gets formed, or lobby. They might be lobbyists or researchers and so on. So they do need exposure. And so in the 4th year, even now with this ecologically strong focus, we will get into social and political things next week when we deal with policy.
Can you see how your students maybe take some of this that they learned from the #Do Something campaign into their 4th year?
Yeah, we have had students who are interested in it, but again, so I think some of the challenges there is that you need ethical clearance, and a lot of them takes too long so they feel like, okay, I'm not going to do it like this, I'm going to do it like that. But it might then show up in the master's level or PhD level. So I must say, I can't think of a student who's taken it through where I can say it was a consequence of, but I can certainly see that thinking being brought, I can see it throughout the trajectory of the degree by the time they graduate. Yeah.
Okay. We have someone with their hand up.
I think it's Adeline.
Adeline, yes, please.
Indeed. Hello. Rhoda, I'm really interested in whether you make it clear that the Do Something campaign can improve employability. I mean, is there a clear link? Because my understanding of these students very often, and I have some relatives, as you know, is where am I going to find a job? Who's going to pay me for all the skills that I've been taught? And I'm sure you make a clear link, but it must really be very positive for them that there is a link indeed.
Yes. So I think, Adeline, the first of all is the fact that of the practical nature of the Do Something campaign. They have to choose something that has to do with their lived experience, and for me, that already brings how they think about employability in the future closer to home. But then also interspersed in all of this, I have guest lectures from people in government, people in the NGO sector, and people in research and fundamental research to come and give guest lectures to them. That's an opportunity for them to build networks and to engage with others. So that's another opportunity for them to ask questions about, how can I do this, that, and the other. And then throughout the lecture series, I might say, oh, this morning I saw this this email from Sanby. Just check out the list of criteria that they're looking for. And I'm pleased to tell you guys that you will have already covered these 5 elements. So this bodes well for you. In fact, I did that just this week. So yeah, we do try to make concrete opportunities for them to see. And we have a Facebook page that Professor Esler keeps going. And through that, we can see where our students end up, and it is so diverse. They end up in all kinds of sectors, in all kinds of countries. And I even hear from our students who have left that they don't struggle to find work, and not for very long, relative to other peers in the age group.
Thanks, Rhoda. And Adelaide, for your question, LZ has asked, do you see scope in the curriculum where your students could, for instance, collaborate, share ideas with students from other faculties like engineering, and thereby help and learn from one another to make sustainability sustainable across disciplines?
Absolutely. So I think that there's scope to collaborate, absolutely. And if we can find a way to do the Do Something campaign between 2 disciplines, and 2 quite disparate disciplines, if it was with Botsu, I think that might be close. I do think it would be insightful. There'd be other benefits, because from a disciplinary point of view, they'd have lots of touch points. But just imagine if this was arts and social sciences, right? The other side of campus. And 2 science domains that are often pitted against one another in the way, or very difficult to reconcile in the methodologies and the epistemologies and so on. So that would be amazing. I mean, imagine the music students across the way. So I do think that collaboration like that would be very exciting. I must say, with life being as full as it is, I just don't see how that's a low-hanging fruit and easy to do. But we've got a group of American students coming over in July, and we're going to see if we can at least get one practical together where we can discuss some of these social ecological systems issues. So I think it's absolutely possible. It would just be a matter of making work of it. That's all.
And then Colette says, this is very inspiring. Thank you for all your effort. LZ, again, will also be amazing if these students could become the next entrepreneurs and not just employees.
Absolutely. So that is part of the reason that I've been engaging with these friends at from the Launch Lab. So one is Dr. Jason Samuels, and he's got a green tech company now. And so Jason, and the other one is Jean-Paul Duplessis. I met Jean-Paul through Jean-Pierre, sorry, through a food security project. But anyway, I invited these 2 guys over, and they are social entrepreneurs themselves. And so I feel very strongly for Faculty of Agri-Science students, as well as for Department of Conservation Ecology, that our students, or any student actually from Stellenbosch University, should also consider their role as job makers and not job takers. That we are not training them for the 350 line, and we are not training them for standing in a queue somewhere looking for work. We should also be training them to be the work suppliers. And so that's part of the inspiration for creating this Do Something campaign, so that they can also apply the creative thinking for solving not just the conservation issues, but also other social issues that go with the crisis of unemployment in their age group. So yeah, I think we're pretty much on that page. And I know that there are other professors in the faculty who feel similarly, that we should be training them to be job makers.
Yes, so this connects well with in the faculty. There's a huge drive to include entrepreneurship throughout all the different programs, and then university-wide, if I'm correct, entrepreneurship is under some of those game changers that we keep on hearing about. Further on, Karen Wolf said, thank you so much. Agree, very inspiring, and I really wish engineering could or would collaborate.
Okay, so come on over to the green side.
Go and connect with Rhoda.
Yeah.
And then Sim, I like cultural awareness, how one can't just judge others on how they respond to the environment, as it is not the same for everyone. Your example about the dunes, have you looked at this as part of graduate attributes, especially here at SU?
So yes, Sim, I definitely have done. I don't have enough time to, can I say, in an abstract way, pull these things together. But if you gave me a list of graduate attributes and asked me, well, which of these do you think the Do Something campaign addresses, I can assure you that they are quite strongly aligned. For me, that was actually part of the reason that I developed the campaign, was in response to our conversation in our department around graduate attributes, and not just training scientists to be scientists, but training scientists as citizens as well.
Response to that, LZ said yes to hashtag job makers.
Yes, job makers, not job takers.
All the entrepreneurs in your program. Any other last questions or comments? We do still have some time left, but we don't want to obviously belabor the topic.
Maybe I can just add that all the practicals in this, in other practicals in the natural sciences, students go out on field trips and they're doing experiments in the lab and so on. This one is quite a social component, as you can see, and so a lot of the work is class-based. It also happens in winter. But what I try to do in the practicals is get the students to learn how to do things that they might be expected to do in the field. So, for instance, if you've got a conflict situation where users of a particular resource are fighting over access to a natural resource, let's say honeybush in the Langkloof. So I share literature with them. So that's one step. But then I might actually reconstruct that situation in the class, and we might do role playing, or I could set them up and say, okay, this is the problem. Let's make a problem tree of what the problem really is. So learning how to do problem analysis in a community setting, so they can replicate exactly what we've done in class, and they could go do that outside. And so that is part of the skill set development. So the practical is also developing skills for the kinds of social skills that conservationists and ecologists need these days. So I just wanted to make that explicit as well, that even the practicals are set up for their training to be real-life actors in conservation science.
So great, so that they can transfer what they learned in class and with this module into their community projects.
Yeah. So somebody's asked you, what about has been most challenging for me? I think one of the things that I struggle with is that I don't know what it's like to experience the environment for somebody who identifies with a gender that I don't understand, or that my students don't understand. So I'm always quite aware that there might be students in my class who don't identify the way that I do, and I'm not sure what that means for them. I can kind of think, I can imagine, my social imaginary scope offers me some kind of leeway on several other fronts. But when it comes to gender, I don't know how a gendered approach to environmental perception might play out. So that's still a challenge for me. And I think also just holding space for my students where they feel safe enough to express themselves from however, because we're bringing up matters of identity, where you live, for instance. So I also do a small exercise in the class called Around the World in 50 Minutes. And so I invite anybody in the class who's from a different place other than Stellenbosch to call up their home on VPike, which is a Google Maps-based application. And it takes you right to your doorstep where you live or wherever you take it. So I always start with myself in Mitchell's Plain. I show them where I grew up. And We visit Karankuwe and we visit Sweden and we visit all kinds of places, and we talk and we just ask two questions. Where did you grow up and what did environment mean for you there? And so for me, environment meant Strandfontein, which was 5 minutes away. It was a colored beach, so we were allowed to go there. We weren't allowed at other beaches. And even for them to hear stuff like that, it's like, what? Are you serious? And we talk about that. And so it's, again, an opportunity to visit your home, to talk about your own environment, and you can offer that however you wish. And we also ask permission to do that. You don't have to if you don't want. So there's another opportunity to hold space in a way that isn't judgmental, that isn't angry with the people living in the suburbs because they have a nicer house or a better whatever. It's just, this is where I live and this is what it means for me. And I've never, I'm aware that I'm holding space all the time. And I think to keep a space like that open for the class where everybody feels welcomed and they feel that they can come with their whole self, even with their family and their home and what the environment means to them. That's the kind of space I try to create in my class. And so it's something that I'm aware of. It's not a challenge so much as something that I'm just highly aware of always. And I think it's important to keep that safe space for them.
Thanks, Rhoda. Sim has asked about making contact with Ruth in the co-curriculum, but I think I also want to skip to two more questions. So Dr. Viljoen, I don't know if you saw that, does the pedagogy of hope refer simply to the optimism to do something to help, or about hope for humanity per se? And are environmentalists still convinced that humans are wonderful and not a cancer on the face of the earth?
Oh dear. So look, my disposition in life is usually quite positive. So I would like to say that I do think it's to do something human agency, and also hope for humanity. Hope for humanity is difficult to warrant when data sets and just, I mean, our lived experience of the Eskom crisis, for instance, makes it very hard to believe differently. But I've seen in other contexts where human agency and creativity have come together to lift people out of poverty, out of gangsterism, out of all kinds of impossible situations. So, I recognize that we are in a crisis discipline, and for good reason. It's not called the crisis discipline sommer so. But because I've seen what is possible with agency, and I also don't want my students to leave thinking that a degree that they've paid so much money for and that they've invested part of their life for is not going to mean anything, because then they're not going to do anything. And I want them to, they are our best chance at making it the way that we need it to be, which is hopeful. And I do think that that is one of our human assets, is hope and agency. I think in post-apartheid South Africa, we have abdicated our responsibility for agency. So we've left it to government to provide whatever. And of course, that's a mistake, because we have agency and we can do things for ourselves. Last week, I addressed a group of people about drought. These are people who have minimal municipal services. And yet, when we finished that webinar, it was about, well, what can we do? We can save water with the next flood. We can, move our shacks a bit higher. We can, and so on. So I do think that agency and hope for humanity are absolutely warranted. For me, that is a human response, even apart from my ecological and scientific response.
A last comment from, is it Susan Henrico, that says her husband is teaching a module on environmental geography at the Faculty of Military Science, to see the wonderful projects that the two of you can talk about. Beautiful example of holding space for others. Thank you for that. I think something else that stood out from that article is the idea that you can't give hope to someone because you're not the holder of that.
Yes.
No one possesses that.
Yes. Yes. You can create, but I do think that you create space for people to find that agency, hope. Again, the things that for me separate us from other animals in the animal kingdom. We have agency, hope, and we have cognitive ability. To my mind, that is the best use of our minds, is to put it to the good use of others. We operate like that as a species. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rhoda. I'm going to hand over to Sim now, who is just going to finish off with some last comments. Thank you, Sim.
Thank you, Shani. Wow, thank you so much, Rhoda, for such an insightful presentation. I really have hope as well today. So, colleagues, thank you for being here attending the first Auxin. We will stay in contact. Our next Auxin is going to be on the 28th of March. And Emeritus Professor Chrissy Bowie is going to be talking about criticality and social justice in teaching and learning. See you there.